The first thing is this idea of the financial center unhooking from the strength or weakness of the domestic economy. And part of why that happened, starting in about the sort of late 50s, early 60s with the euro markets, was to do with regulation and it was to do with tax. And we're now in a world in Europe where you see very specific measures coming from the EU, which we are told, inspired by the French and the Germans, which are directed at weakening London's competitive position. We've got the financial transactions tax proposal. We've got a whole raft of regulatory proposals for the securities industry. We've got the European Central Bank trying to insist that euro-denominated business should be cleared within the eurozone. How dangerous is that for London? How insidious is this process going to be?
Well, probably not at all, I suspect, is the answer. And, you know, I can say this as a lawyer. People pay far too much attention to law. Law really has remarkably little impact on the way that business is actually done in real life. I mean, you know, we all know that wonderful Wall Street cartoon of the two bankers looking at an enormous pile of paper and one saying to the other, these new regulations will completely revolutionize the way we get around them. But that is roughly how it tends to work. Take a little bit of historical perspective. I mean, we've just had a very old-fashioned crisis caused by, you know, the market for credit instruments moving from an incomplete to a complete market, which kicked off a bubble. Exactly the same thing happened when the market for equity started becoming a complete market at the beginning of the 18th century in the South Sea bubble. Now, the response to the South Sea bubble was a thing called the Stock Jobbing Act, which basically prohibited securities trading for the best part of 60 years, what nowadays would be called a macro-prudential policy tool. It was during that period that the stock market developed. I mean, attempts by governments to ban things have a lot less impact than you'd expect in a world where there is a buyer and a seller and a market. I mean, it is interesting. If you look at the financial transactions tax particularly, the Commission's own study on the FTT said it would raise 0.08 of 0.08, I'm sorry, of European GDP in revenue at the cost of a loss of GDP of something like 3.6%. You know, this is one of the very few taxes in history that will reduce government revenue. It is, you know, it's not really a tax. What it is an attempt to indirectly prohibit a big wodge of activity. So there's no question about that. But I'm fairly highly confident that it won't be successful in that aim.
But if, Chris, if we take, let's assume that Simon is right, but with all the other sort of raft of regulation that is coming out of Brussels, does it worry you that the British government it lacks the degree of influence in Brussels that the French and the Germans have, and that it could be marginalizing itself in political terms in the debate not only over securities regulation, but over the wider governance of the Eurozone?
And I think, to be honest, that's the million-dollar question, or the $100 billion question, whatever the big bazooka figure is at the moment. I think we have, at my last count, over 30 directives, pieces of regulation coming our way. We've just been through an era-changing redesign of how regulation gets done across Europe. The arrival of the new 3 supervisory bodies was a page-turner. We're currently remodeling how we do regulation here in the UK, and we've managed to come up with a system that doesn't fit snugly with the European one. And I think what we're looking at is a period of not only substantial change, but uncertainty as well. And so that's bound to throw the politics of the equation astray. So if we just step back for a moment and think, why have we got here? Well, part of the reason we've got here is pre-financial crisis, most UK-based firms felt it was sufficient to trip along to Canary Wharf and see the FSA, and they would sort out the regulatory environment for them, engage with the Treasury to a certain degree, and Brussels was something that happened over there. And then we had the financial crisis, and suddenly that became not sufficient anymore. But the UK retired from the stage. We held a leadership position, whether we'd like to acknowledge it or not, but we held a leadership position in Brussels where actually, because of and I think that technically we were very good, always have been very good at regulation. And I wouldn't put it as strongly as saying that other European member states deferred to us, but there are probably 3 or 4 policy-making states and the rest are policy-taking states. But because of the financial crisis, because of the fact that I think the FSA was the first organisation to conduct an independent review that said it's all our fault, we got Northern Rock wrong, therefore the whole world came a cropper and that's our fault, very sorry, and nobody else did, the Anglo-Saxon model was to blame. And I've heard that so many times in the corridors of Brussels, the Anglo-Saxon model was to blame. And we didn't have a response. We ummed and ahed and did the traditional British thing of looking at our feet for far too long. And others have sought to take advantage of that. No two ways about it. No two ways about it. You only have to look at MiFID and the way that the French have pursued a clear agenda. And good luck to them, because this is a competitive sport. I think it's a case of what do we do now? How do we energise our government? What's the industry's role across Europe? Because we shouldn't keep going to the Treasury and saying, dear Treasury, please deliver this for us. This is our industry. So we have a role to play here in developing the industry and the regulation that we want. So I think the challenge is for us to start being actually more proactive, more positive in our engagement. Mark Hoban tells a story of talking to Bob Diamond, I think it was, about the number of people he had in Barclays working in Dodd-Frank. Bob said, well, on this particular exercise, I have 70 people working on just this part of the regulatory legislative proposal. I think that, hand on heart, I'm not sure how many institutions in Europe employ 70 people in their regulatory environment entirely. And so there is a disconnect, I think. I'm not pushing that we should have an American-type system, but what I'm saying is that there is a disconnect between the importance of financial services to our economy, the strength of our financial services firms, and actually how rigorously we engage and seek to shape the agenda, not only in Brussels, but in Paris and in Frankfurt, actually in Sweden, and across Europe. And I think one of the things we have to get better at as an industry is recognizing that if we want change at a regulatory level, we need to be engaging partners across Europe to get the messages across, rather than pursuing a single track objective, which involves going to Treasury and then from Treasury to UCREP, and so on and so on.
Ruben.
Yeah. Why don't you go first?
Well, Michael, could I just ask, first of all, your response to what has been said here, but also a comment on the relative regulatory positions of New York and London, and how you think that their response to the crisis and our response to the crisis will fall out in terms of potential loss of business to either centre.
I think if there's a theme to the comment I'm about to make, it's about complacency, and I pick up on what Chris is saying. I have a lovely quote tucked away somewhere when I'm doing a speech on, and it's a regulator who talks about the importance of their center. English, good regulation, a trusted regulator, great time zone, absolutely fantastic, and the use of common law. There's only one problem: the regulator's in charge of Hong Kong. And it's important. I think we've been very, very complacent. That quote's, I think, from 2008. And it stunned me, because I was reading this, just as you do, skimming the press and thinking, oh, who said that in London? And it was clearly Hong Kong. My bit on complacency is, I think, twofold. We've been very complacent about our standing in the city, and we've been, I think, dishonest with ourselves. Britain has fallen down, for example, quite significantly in Transparency International's corruption index. We have a lot of areas which we need to improve. The carbon markets are a good example. You talk about rule of law and all that. Well, there's been a 45 million euro theft, and nobody's done anything about it. So what are my property rights here? In China, somebody would be up against a wall by now. Not approving of that, but you got to say to yourself, that's, it's a lovely system and it pays a lot of lawyers, but what does it achieve? So there's, I think, some problems there about just general complacency. I think Chris was touching on a bit that really does irk me. 4 years ago, we started to have a series of pretty significant financial crises. We hold ourselves out as the brightest boys in Europe and girls in Europe on all this stuff, and we're darn good at regulation, and we're darn good at that and all that. And yes, Brussels came to talk to us, and it said, well, we think it's offshore. But we said, no, you're fools, it's not offshore. Okay, well, they come back again. We think it was hedge funds. Oh, no, you idiots, it's not hedge funds. Well, we thought it might be to do with MiFID type things. No, it's not that. We have said no to every single proposal. And we've not come up with, as an industry, a proposal back. And there are real problems. I mean, I'm sorry, Repo 105, that involved Ernst & Young and Linklaters. We've been guilty. Now, either we're delusional, there wasn't a financial crisis and we want to deny it, or we want to believe everything's brilliant. And I have this sort of intelligence integrity index where I say we've had actuaries, accountants, auditors, lawyers. We've had this whole system here to do something. Now, if that system is functioning, then there's clearly no need for reform. I'll buy that. I'd just like to see who's in the dock. I don't know a single lawyer, accountant, auditor, rating agency person who's in front of their professional institute for having contributed to the financial crisis. I'm not saying that's the right answer, but if it is true that they're all good and noble men and women, then maybe our institutions need a bit of look. And I'd like to see each institution come up with just one thing that it would go to Brussels and say, we've been giving it a bit of thought for 4 years, and if you made this little change, it might actually result in a better system. We failed to do that. And I find that complacent. Ruben.
Yeah, I'm, again, hearing you, we're all, I presume, supporters of the city. I am a big supporter of the city and of the UK. But hearing you, I disagree with what I think is an implicit premise in the approach. And the premise is that being good at technical issues, so being good at regulation or at competition policy or at running an exchange, all these technical issues leads to influence, leads to the ability to sway opinion in a global regulatory environment. And my view is that contrary to what you were saying, and indeed contrary to what Michael is saying, I think we've been exceptionally poor at European diplomacy for much longer than 4 years, okay? And there's nothing new in the past 4 years that makes us even poorer. It's hard to go lower. And the way to win these sort of battles is, yes, to be substantively correct, and we can do that well, but to be politically sophisticated. Yes. And this is not a mea culpa, but this is, we as the Brits have been very, very poor at shaping the European agenda, at understanding the politics, at being what a politician has to do, at not being two-faced, but dealing with multiple constituencies, at giving people what they want, at dancing through the multiple minefields. We've been very poor at that. So I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't put it down to a lack of ideas on specific, MiFID or whatever it may be. I would put it much deeper than that.
And sorry,
Simon, do you share the view that we're punching so far below our weight in Europe?
Well, I do. Sorry, and Simon, I'll come to you.
Okay.
I just write a reply and all
right.
that. My central premise is that we have left too much to the technocrats. That the game has changed fundamentally, that the arrival of the ESAs, which I think from a UK perspective we looked at as being technical bodies, are being asked to engage in political discussions. And we have been wrong-footed again. I think we failed in our attempts, half-hearted in my view, attempts to secure the leadership of those organisations because we fielded candidates who are technocrats, not senior politicians. We failed to socialise them across the capitals of Europe. We're failing today to have identified the fact that those people who are currently running the ESAs will, funnily enough, retire at some point. So we need to have the cohort of candidates who we are today socialising. So we're looking at, I'm not sure whether it's more Europe or less Europe, but it's certainly more political Europe, and we are so far behind the game, and this is the moment where we need to catch up. So, sorry, I was arguing that rather like three-dimensional chess, we still need to be excellent in the technocratic arguments, but we must recognise the sweep of politics that are certainly buffeting our industry. So forgive me if I was less clear about that. Totally endorse.